Good morning, everyone. I just want to make a special word of thanks for Karen for inviting me. She saw me speak a few years ago when I was midway through my doctoral studies, and it's a great pleasure to share my work in a more coherent form, I hope, this time. As some of you will have realised who I've spoken to during the week, I'm a New Zealander, but I have lived here for the last 21 years. I have recently, just a few weeks ago, defended my doctoral research in an oral exam, so if I have to cut this talk short, you can contact me and I'll be happy to share the work with you. I wish to discuss key ideas with some examples from my own creative practice and talking about how art-led transversal practices can enable us to exit the ecocide of the Anthropocene. Coming from an art practice perspective, how do we create relevant, engaging and inspiring ecological art practice? How can we reflect, even reverse the ecocide, the silent spring caused by industrial land practices? In this talk, I'll explain why some important ecological art practices responding to these concerns remain on the margins of the contemporary art world. And I'll discuss some of the challenges people who do engage with this area face. And I'll talk about why I argue and propose that a Guattarian Ecosophy-Action research framework is a valuable guiding theory method for the art and ecology field. And we've had a lot about the context of the times we're living in, but I just thought I would put up a couple of quotes that I work by. We live in an unprecedented age of the Anthropocene, the age of humankind where industrial Western culture is now recognised as changing the geology of the earth. Professor Brian Swim says, we live in the most destructive period in the last 65 million years. However, I also like to reflect on the first woman in Africa to gain a PhD, Nobel Peace winner Wangari Maathai, who planted forests in Kenya. And she says that there are opportunities even in the most difficult moments. We also know from environmental philosophers such as Kathleen Dean Moore that with the scientific understanding we now have of the ecological emergency, that we have a moral imperative to act, even if the consequences of our actions appear limited. This is an important point to convey to any art student or creative practitioner. To look the other way is like any other crime. It's morally unconscionable and it promotes the status quo. I would like so many more people and creative people to engage in this area. Scientists are saying that this is the hinge decade where we have the most opportunity to avoid the catastrophes ahead. I'd just briefly like to talk about how some people are starting to look at the word Anthropocene and think about it and trouble that word a bit more. Donna Haraway and others have said the Anthropocene would be better described as the capitalist scene, as it rests on the unsustainable advance of a globalised extractive capitalism. Haraway further characterises a large engine of the Anthropocene as the plantation-ocene, as industrial culture has simplified much of the planet's living diversity into slave monoculture plantations. Industrial monoculture clearfell forestry, the main type of forestry in Ireland and in large parts of the colonised world, particularly even where I come from in New Zealand, is the force of my eco-social art practice. And this is a new album from singer-songwriter Cathy Davey, and she also speaks to this from a very emotional point of view. Also, sociologist Charles Darber has argued that since the industrial society is causing the sixth great mass extinction, the great dying, and it's the accelerated condition that we're living in a sociopathic society. And I'll come back to that point as it underlines the theorist that I chose to further articulate long-term ecological projects. So how do we move away from the end game of the Anthropocene? Former Professor of Sustainability and farmer Glenn Albrecht talks how we must urgently exit the Anthropocene and enter the Symbiocene. He argues that we must quickly adopt new thinking, new practices, and a politics of mutualism where we value the symbiotic flourishing of all life, and forests are particularly great to look at in this respect. He talks that we must develop memes for the Symbiocene, and I see some long-term eco-art practices, mine included, can work as powerful means for societal learning and change. And although not widely appreciated in art education or in Irish national cultural policy, at UN level it is recognised that cultural responses are one of the 4 pillars for driving local examples of sustainability in our areas. Even recent neuroscience confirms that facts alone will not change societal behaviour, and I think that's very evident. In particular, I'm interested in creative practices that build bridges between art, science, and other ways of knowing, that recognise the value of lived experience, local knowledges, and the intrinsic rights of non-human communities to thrive. I see long-term ecological art practices as being very valuable. They operate by artistically weaving art and non-art activities together in a cycle of questions and reflection, and often address the business-as-usual extractive land practices that we witness and live within. In my own eco-social art practice, I combine life world, or my lived experience from different disciplines and disciplinary knowledges. I have a background in research science. I learned continuous cover forestry, which is new to Ireland, from professional foresters. I have green political experience and policy writing skills. And then on the art side, I bring to that my video and photography work. And from looking after an online community, I very much value the skills that I have in networking online for local audiences, but for further afield. I blend these various skills and life world knowledges to explore how we can move away from the life-limiting unsustainability of monoculture forestry, to instead investigate new to Ireland, close to nature, continuous cover forestry. Some foresters have actually been talking about this for the last 16 years, but it's a conversation that's still very much new to a lot of people. The bottom image is an area of the plantation that I live with that is changing to a mixed species permanent forest, which we call Hollywood. This area is sheltered by the conifers that we have selectively felled to create pockets of light to encourage natural regeneration of native species. We continue to selectively fell to create a flourishing continuous cover forest. The conifers and native species are used together for integrated aims for biodiversity, enriched stable soils, carbon sequestration and firewood production, and increased birdsong. A few years ago we've got off our oil for heating our home and now rely on our own wood. And we thin every 3 years, and from 2 acres we get 70 tonnes of firewood. So it's quite considerable, and we have a great climate for growing trees if you're new to this country. Hollywood is the smallest close to nature continuous cover forest in Ireland, but even though it is small, I like to think of it as the little wood that could. Because while it is small and it is a very slow art practice, it has advanced new experimental videos that reflect my and others' new forestry learning. It also provides science data, which is contributed to a local Irish forestry journal. The project has enabled me to advocate these practices as the key approach to sustainable forestry for the Irish Green Party. And living inside Hollywood, I have developed a political voice, which quite surprised me, to share the news of developing laws against the crime of ecocide, how industrial practices like monoculture forestry are a slow violence against life. However, despite the urgency of the planetary crisis, practices such as mine remain marginalised. For example, in Ireland, there is no mention at national level that art and sustainability should be coming to work together. And there are very few programs both here and in the UK. And the reason for this is that the ecological worldview challenges the basic tenets of the Western worldview. Ecology makes us consider the necessity of thriving human, non-human systems, when the Western culture, from its earliest origins as a culture of extraction for material advancement, has largely written out the agency of the non-human world, particularly since the Enlightenment. An ecological worldview contradicts capitalism's mainstream narratives, and it decenters the primacy of humankind and human concerns, which much art is currently focused. Eco-art practices therefore require new skills of mutuality, deep listening, which has already been raised this morning, and paying attention to others, including the non-human. There are many parallels in how we are discovering that trees work symbiotically with fungi to develop flourishing forests. On the surface, these practices seem very diverse, but in my research, I began to see patterns in the aims of such practices, and that these practices routinely involve similar key method stages. In particular, my practice and theory research argues that such practices are much more than interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. I argue that such practices actually involve a lot of lived knowledge, and I've looked at Guattari to understand why these assemblages of art and non-art, I suppose, understandings advance political, ethical and aesthetic innovations, both for the artists but also their audiences. Some of you may be aware of Guattari's slim and some say unfinished concept of the three ecologies. My research uncovered that his concept of transversality, developed over many decades, was little understood for this context. Guattari's transversality is a means to recognise how new values, new subjectivities arise from individual collective assemblages that combine life world and disciplinary knowledges. And just briefly, Guattari is a complex figure. He was a therapist involved in looking after the treatment of psychotic patients for many years. But he instinctively, as he was also involved in the early stages of the Green Party in France, he was an activist and he was a new media enthusiast. So he understood that the environmental crisis was rooted in calcified mental and unquestioned social practices. He understood capitalism seizes people's minds in an overcode, that the politics of the left or right could not defeat it, and that a scientific technological paradigm was gravely insufficient to counter its pervasiveness, and that tech advances will not treat the roots of the crisis. So I'm just going to skip a little bit. Just to summarise, and I can go on about Guattari for a long time, but Guattari's concepts helps build understanding that sustainability is contingent, and it relates very much to individual locations and communities, but that it's an ever-evolving state that is enriched by democratic participation and different ways of knowing. It's not, Guattari's theory is not for everyday talking about in the pub how you start an eco-art practice. So I came to the realisation when somebody came to me who was experienced in art and action research that there was a lot about action research that speaks to Guattari's ideas of transversality. And he was interested just before he died as well. And I found in my analyses that action research used widely in other fields can be used to frame Guattari's key ideas and provide an accessible method pathway for long-term eco-social art practices. I applied it to mine and others' practices in my research. And the above diagram shows how action research identifies the circular pathway of caring, questioning, reflection and action. It is a departure from the scientific and colonial research model. It is not prescriptive but a reactive pathway. Action research speaks to Guattari's ideas and how we can accommodate many ways of knowing actions and have an inclusive approach to listening to communities. And I'm just going to flick through just some images from my practice, how action research makes me consider the practical challenges, how it's so important to go back to the forest, to really value experiential knowledge. We're not going to move forward by the knowledge that we know now. We have to go back and look at how systems are working symbiotically. I'm very lucky that the late Dr. Chris Seeley saw me present my work some years ago, and she really values the really important role that art has to play in action research, for engaging audiences and from translating the experiential into something more tangible for audiences. It also allows me to still use my scientific knowledge and contribute in that way. Action research, particularly participatory action research, is now being used to think about how do we relate to non-human communities. It's also a great way of understanding why I eventually moved towards new policy and getting involved in politics. And action research at its heart, in the centre of that diagram I put up, really values the dialogue and the conversations that come out of these projects. That's the real art. A lot of people criticise this type of working as where is the art? It's actually in the new ideas, the new values, the lived experience, the conversations. And just in summary, this is a drawing I gave to my supervisors when I started my PhD, and that was what was going on in my head. It was very hard to talk about how I was progressing my project, but I was doing it from intuition and looking from other people that I admired. So I just conclude that I believe that the Ecosophy-Action research framework significantly improves the articulation of long-term eco-social art practices. And it does this in a way because action research method stages have terms that are well recognised in health and education. So I think it would be of value for quite a number of people working in this way, so that there's more peer-to-peer exchange. This framework also highlights the value and potential in and beyond the contemporary art world of the value of these types of practices. And I was very fortunate in having the space to develop a practice-based PhD. So I was able to present my art research as part of my submission. And I've created an e-book, and I've also created this print-on-demand book that should be available shortly. And I'm a blogger as well, so my main creative practice is bringing all these knowledges together on my blog. So you can follow the story of the little wood that could at hollywoodforest.com. Thank you very much.